the Atma Shakti cycle of teachings. What does it mean? Atma means self. Shakti means power, self-power. So in ancient tradition of spiritual work all around the world, there was considered to be a self that was desiring some type of realization experience that would tell them what their true nature is and what the nature of the universe is and what is the relation between yourself and the universe. So we're going to talk now specifically the traditions that came out of Central Asia and poured into Tibet to the east, India to the southeast, China to the far east, Mongolia to the northeast, Iran to the southwest, etc. And in the type of ideology that came out of that Central Asian experience that developed into the Rishi tradition for India, the Buddhist tantric tradition for Tibet, and the Bun tradition for Tibet, and the Dao Jia for Chinese, and so on. In these traditions, there was the understanding that our own experience of life was very limited, to think that we were only an individual, discrete self. In other words, a body that has this limited lifespan, consciousness that was created by our neurology, our brain or something, and then we die. In fact, that was an idea that didn't even exist in the old world, was that, you just live and then you die. That never existed until modern times. Instead, what people thought was, we have this body, this physical body, and some of the camps, there's two camps basically. One camp said that this physical body has a spirit and other things within it, and when the physical body dies, that spirit goes on as an individual entity for eternity or whatever. Or it becomes absorbed into another reality, a universal type of enlightened reality. The other camp said that there is no real discrete entity of a physical body, even because our physical body has been changing from the moment of conception. It's been growing and dying simultaneously, because we're all slated to die, and changing constantly right up till the moment it disappears and becomes recycled soil. So the other camp, and that other camp, says that, look, along with that, our experience of being human is just a conglomeration, a combination of a lot of different energies. Here we call it the 10 forces. So right away, we had to deal with the understanding. If we're going to really understand what Atma Shakti practice is, we have to understand a few things about this self, right? Atma Shakti means self-power. The self that we're dealing with here can be searched for through meditation, through introspection, through contemplation. And what you'll find is there's no solid, substantial, discrete, eternal entity. There's no soul that lasts forever. And this is very different to the Abrahamic coalition of religions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and some others in the world that would say you have a body and a soul and a mind, these three components. Well, here, when we talk about Atma Shakti, we're saying that the human experience is what we're talking about. That's a localization of consciousness. Here was the breakthrough that these ancient masters that went from shamanism to tantric yoga, here was the breakthrough that they came up with. They realized through their introspection, through their spiritual experimentation and self-discovery, that there was no real discrete entity. And yet in English, we have to call it a self, right? But what they realized was that there is an ongoing experience of perception, of awareness, of knowing. And that this knowing, perceiving, awareness capacity exceeds life and death, exceeds beyond any kind of limitations or boundaries when it's discovered at its source. So in this mode, when our tradition, which comes from those ancient masters from India, from Tibet, from China, all these traditions, we draw from all of them in the Mahasiddha tradition, because the great adept practitioners from all of them realized the highest truth And when they did, they all realized the same thing and described it in slightly different ways. On the way to that realization, there are different sects or religions that they came from, had a little more problem getting along, you know. But once they reached the highest levels of realization, stages 10, 11, and 12 of human journey through life, they all said the same thing and all did the same practices and had the same realization. So these adepts taught very strongly that we have three bodies, basically. We call them bodies, but three experiences. So we said now the self, so far we've gotten to this idea that the self is some type of ongoing, but not substantial, awareness, knowing capacity, ability to perceive, etc. Okay, we got that so far. Now, when we are experiencing that aspect of the knowing, of the awareness, where it's not that it's not aware of objects. Let's say I'm that awareness knowing, and I'm looking at my roll of tape here. Okay. It's not that I'm not aware of the tape and the tape is still there. When the tape folds into the one knowing experience, and there is no what's called subject, object, movement of mind or awareness to the senses. This is duality, right? Subject, object, duality. When that is not there anymore, not because I am ignoring the object world, like in a trance, but when I'm accessing that aspect of my being that we call source force and black resolving force and base and Dharmakaya and all these different names for it, Shiva Bindu, it means that there is no subject-object dichotomy at all in that experience. So this is one of our bodies, one of our three bodies. In Shaivism, it was called the Shiva Bindu. In Vajrayana, it's called the Dharmakaya. In Bun, it's called the Bunku. In Daojia, it's called the body of the Tao. So they all had the same idea. There's an experience that we can have as a knower of awareness and consciousness, which does not break up into subject-object. Okay, great. That's part of our self-experience. Then, if we look at another one of these bodies, there's a body of pure potential energy, pure potentiality. And that body is constantly coming in and out of being and out of form. And the form is pure virtue. So it's a type of knowing experience that has an expression as what we would call a virtue, such as love, compassion, wisdom, courage, joy, loyalty, truthfulness, like all these different virtuous capacities are arising out of our second body, or actually are composing our second body. So we have this body. The first one is like this space body, this one we talked about of non-duality, right? The Dharmakaya, the Bunku, the Tao body, etc. Shiva Bindu. This one is the Shakti Bindu, or the energy or power potentiality. In other words, this body, this other body that we are, is the body that allows things to come into being. And it is a type of non-dual experience as well, which is really incredible. So all the virtues are something which are unlimited. All the energies of creation are existing on unlimited energy, right? Unbounded, not substantial energy. It's quite different. And then the last body that we have, this one is the one that everyone debates about, that religions and traditional sectarian divisions are created around. Do we have a self? Do we not have a self? What is our self-experience? So the Buddha kind of campaigned on his trail by saying there's his principle of anatma, meaning no self, that there's no self. When you look there, you can't find one. Our Mahasiddha tradition agrees with the Buddha's exploration, and that's been my experience too. You can meditate all you want, contemplate 20, 30, 40 years, you're never going to find a discrete self like this pen, something that never undergoes change, a self that never undergoes change, that has boundaries, clear boundaries and functions and so on. It doesn't exist. So the Buddha was countering the experience of the Atman, which was being put out by religious Brahmins at the time in India. And so do we. We counter that idea too, that there's a Brahman that's a discrete entity that hangs around in heaven with a God, a creator God. So as you look at our understanding of self, the great siddhas before us, the great masters, the adepts before us, also struggled with a way to describe this using words because it's very difficult. They said, well, we know there's an experience going on. So one thing we could agree upon was, you're having your experience right now, sitting there watching me teach this, reading your notes, having a coffee, a donut, oversleeping, whatever it is you're doing at this moment. You're having your own experience. I'm having my own experience. We can't say that those are not happening. I mean, we can, but then I think we're kind of psychotic. The original Advaita Vedanta position was that the very sectarian, strong religious understanding of Vedanta is, if you've ever heard of Vedanta from India, is that this experience isn't even happening, that we are not even having this experience. They say it's an illusion, not a delusion, but an illusion. The Shaivist yogis were much more practical. They would say this is a delusion. We are an apparition. We are an appearance, what's called an abhasa in Sanskrit. So we kind of are here ghost-like, but we're not really. So they're like 1 foot in each. They couldn't quite go with this isn't happening at all, Vedanta. They couldn't go with the real Brahmanic version of, no, you have an Atman, it's the size of your thumb, it's in your heart, and it never gets destroyed, and that's your ultimate essence, and it's always, one with everything in a certain sense. They couldn't go there either. Because their experience, the yogins came out of shamanism, their experience was that there's an indivisibility between these three bodies. And all we could come back to is, and everybody could agree on in Shaivist yoga and so on, which then became Tibetan Buddhist Tantra and the Daoji as well. Everyone, these three schools and Dzogchen could agree that there is something happening as the basic tenet. We're not crazy. Well, we might be a little crazy, but there's something happening, right? And then how clearly we can experience what's happening dictates how realized or how enlightened we are, okay? And the next logical tenet they went to was that, okay, we're experiencing something, but what is it that's going on? And what is it that's doing this experiencing? Okay. And there's some ultimate division in the religious level of Taoism and Shaivism and Dzogchen and Vajrayana. But again, the Mahasiddhas, the adepts, went past that and found the same truth at the very end, stages 10, 11, 12. But what they can agree on is that, and the Shaivist, I think, said it the most beautifully with this word in Sanskrit, kshetra jna. They said, what is our self? It's a kshetra jna. It's Atma Shakti, sure, it's self-power. That's described by the 10 forces. But that self-power, Atma Shakti, is a term that's only used specifically when we're teaching the sub-cycle of teachings of the greater system of Mahasiddha Yoga called Atma Shakti, describing just the individual's experience, perspective, right? Here, when we say kshetra jna, this is a term that describes this Atma Shakti, this individual that we are, but does it in such a way that it doesn't nail it down to anything specific and says it's an experience of awareness. Kshetra means an area or a field, right? And jna implies knowing, a knower. It implies a knower, pure awareness without an object. So a kshetra jna, as a Shaivist yogin would describe themselves, is not a soul, not a body, not a mind, but a field where awareness is most likely to arise. In this way, it's very similar if you ever learned quantum mechanics in chemistry, and you learned that kind of chemistry has a p orbital, right? QRST, all these different orbitals, meaning a shape. They show you a shape and they say, within this atom or molecule, the electron is going to show up somewhere as an average in this shape, like a balloon or a circle or a line or whatever. And that's called an orbital, right? So they're not saying where it's going to be exactly, because you can't actually. And that's the same as us. Everybody listening to this right now, You are a kshetrajna. You are a field where awareness just spontaneously arises, actually. It's not due to your own effort. And that's really kind of interesting. So this field isn't solid. It can morph. It can be dulled. It can be clarified, right? It can be brighter or duller, darker. And this experience of the self, of this kshetrajna, is what we're looking at specifically in the 10 dynamic forces of self-power teaching. There's a larger teaching, the Atma Shakti teaching itself, the self-power teaching, which goes into great detail about how we got here, what is our fate in the world, and so forth. How do we find our fate and all that? That will be happening at other times during the year when you see the Atma Shakti teachings. This cycle, sub-cycle of teachings, the 10 dynamic forces of self-power, is a way to look at what are actually what is the composition of this kshetrajna. What are we animated by? Okay, if we're just a field of awareness where it arises, it's obviously not static or passive in totality. There's obviously some movement, some activity, some manifesting, some loss, everything's going on, change. What is that change? Well, there are 10 processes. And these 10 processes make up the 10 dynamic forces of ourself. And when, this is for the spiritual practitioners in the group here, when people get very high in the stages, when they start going through the emptiness stage of 7 into 8 and 9, something like that, sometimes people start to get the experience that, oh, everything I thought before about having a self was wrong. This happens a lot in stage 7 because it's the stage of pure openness. It's the stage in our spiritual practice where we move from most of our attention on our individual self, and it naturally gives way and moves over to our self as spaciousness, as pure awareness with no object. And when we're in that frame of mind and perception a lot, we start to look back on what we learned about our individual self, about the 10 forces, about life in general, and so on, the dual world. And we start to think, oh, that's really an illusion. They were kind of right, or it's really dreamy, right? And then we start to discount the individual experience with the 10 forces. But in a holistic view of spiritual development like Trikamasiddha Yoga, when you move through the higher stages, you maintain an experience of this individual nature, because we teach that there's always the 3 together. Moving through the higher stages doesn't like take this body away and just leave behind a pure, open, spacious awareness with the potential for manifestation, these 2 bodies. No, it's not like that. This one's always there as we move through the higher stages. It's just that our experience of it changes, obviously. It must necessarily change if we are to move onward. But here's the fundamental thing I'm trying to say. We must have this experience of the soul power, the Atma Shakti, the self-power, the 10 forces. It must be a current part of our experience and integrated with these other 2 bodies if we are to be whole. Because if I only have the experience of this space body, then I'm going to be spaced out. Basically, if I think that that's the reality and all this was illusion of an individual self and all the manifested world. So if I'm just space and just knowing, then I'm just going to sit on a rock and meditate forever and disappear. And there's many systems that believe that. But in our tradition, it's said to be whole is to find the truth of yourself and try to find the truth of the universe. And that's what this is all about. That's what this training is all about. So we don't need to spend a whole lot of time really going deeply into now, is there a self? What is the self? Basically it's a field of awareness. We all agree that some individual experience is happening. So we have to sort that out. It's not an illusion. We're not psychotic. We have general consensus that something is happening here. We have the real understanding that it's temporary, that our individual life body dies, and that it ceases at some point. But the body itself is a product of one of these 10 forces, or a few of these forces. And we want to understand that if we have a clear picture of what animates this field of awareness, this kshetrajna that each of us are, that we can actually become masterful in our physical reality for however long or short it is. You know, we never know when we're going to die, but we can gain a certain type of mastery. And a lot of times people don't like that term these days, mastery, you know, but we have to be masterful of our own experience. If we're not masterful of our own experience, well, then what are we, right? We'll be blown around like a leaf in the wind and never really know who we are. So the stability that's created by having this self-experience, your Kshetranya, your Jivatma Shakti developed, or in Sanskrit, like Tibetan Buddhists and Bumpos will call it Nirmanakaya, you know, or Choku, the individual body. Well, by having that really well developed, we create a very good, stable experience in our emotions, in our mind, in our health, and we increase our longevity. We increase our luck, our fortune, our opportunity. All the parameters that we consider a good life, we increase. No matter what the outer circumstances are, we increase our own experience of these good qualities. And that makes a very good foundation, a good basis for going deeper into spiritual work. Developing the individual experience within the greater framework of the space body and the potential body is also very good to keep us grounded, so we don't get very spaced out, become like, you know, a new age hippie and spout out non-dual aphorisms all day long while we kind of, you know, don't have our act together. And that's not a good way to develop either. We have to wake up out of that trance someday if we're in that. And then we have to do all kinds of groundwork to get grounded again and develop fundamental skills and so on. But let me put out the caveat. It's also just as dangerous to now focus only on your individual Atma Shakti, your self-power, because that kind of a focus turns it into an object, which it isn't. 10 flowing forces appearing somewhere in this conscious space of awareness. That's all it is. That's all we are. When we focus too strongly on it, let me pick on bodybuilders and models for a second. If you're focused too strongly on how you look, and that's your whole life, okay, and you have no spiritual awareness whatsoever, then, I mean, you've lost the point of being alive. And you've reduced these three bodies. You've taken away these two from your awareness. You only have the one body. And when you focus on the one body by itself, you turn it into a roll of tape, right? And it's quite traumatic for you when that body gets old, when it dies, when it decays. This can be the same for someone who's, let's say, a super powerful business person, focused on their business skills, focused on the enjoyment of doing business every day and their money. Again, we can become too focused on any one of these self-images that we create. And then we shut down the naturally spiritualizing force of the Atma Shakti to realize the other two bodies and to gain a sense of integration with the other two to become a realized Mahasiddha, or enlightened being, a Buddha. Okay, so we don't want to ignore that Atma Shakti. We don't want to overemphasize it out of the context of a deeper spiritual journey, right? If possible. I know some of you on this broadcast are not deeply into spiritual practice. That's okay. Maybe some of you have a psychology view of the world. Maybe some of you have a science view of the world. Maybe some of you are still deeply into one of the dualistic religions. That's fine too. So just hear what I'm saying and let it sink in, and over the next few weeks, see where it places for you. But even if you don't have a spiritual view that maybe, let's say, you don't believe that you have a space body, or a body of total space, spacious, unlimited awareness, or a body of this potential energies, you know, and you only think that you have this individual self. Well, by paying attention to the 10 forces, you're still going to increase your good experience of life. And this is where my master said, you know, it's okay for people to do it that way and pursue that way, because by attending to the 10 forces this way and cultivating them, there is awareness being applied already that is outside the normal limitations of a self-image, right? When we form self-images, we're very limited. But even applying the 10 forces to kind of pump up the experience of being more successful or contented in life or psychologically whole will by itself innately eventually spiritualize us. So we can't go wrong either way. So, okay, now we know basically what we are as a self. We kind of know how important it is. Now we want to look at how do we assess our dynamic forces, because they are intangible in a certain sense. They are forces that are flowing through us, and we can only really see their effects. So when we go to assess our dynamic forces, yes, it's possible for a person who practices Kundalini Hatha yoga and spiritual meditation and things like that to get sensitive enough to just sense those 10 forces, right? But until we have that sensitivity developed, how do we really work with that? How do we know it?